Good morning, everyone. This is Recycling in New Hampshire, State of Recycling Markets, and we are glad to be here today at the New Hampshire Municipal Association's conference. My name is Reagan Bissonette. I'm the Executive Director of the Northeast Resource Recovery Association, and I'm joined here by Bonnie Bethune.
Good morning, everyone. It's nice to be here with you.
So here's our agenda for where we're going to be going today. We'll briefly introduce the Northeast Resource Recovery Association. Then we'll talk about recycling and sort of an introduction to recycling. Then delve into recycling markets and finally talk about budget impacts for communities based on those recycling markets and other changes that are happening right now. And we will be available to answer any questions as they come up in the Q&A in the Whova app. And we're also going to leave some time at the end specifically for questions. So to introduce the Northeast Resource Recovery Association, we are a recycling nonprofit. We were founded over 40 years ago to help communities with their recycling and to reduce their waste. We now have over 450 members throughout New England, but most of those municipalities are in New Hampshire and Vermont. And over 80% of New Hampshire's towns and cities are members of ours. Our mission is to help communities manage their own recycling programs in a financial and environmentally sustainable ways. And we achieve that in two key areas of our programs. So first, we offer cooperative marketing and purchasing programs. And this means that we basically help communities sell their recyclables. So we are one of only a handful of nonprofits in the entire country that operates a model like this, where we're essentially a recycling broker. And so when communities have any variety of recyclables that they need to move to market, we're helping them achieve that. And in 2020, we returned over $1.8 million to our members from the sale of their recyclables. Now, we like to think of ourselves as a one-stop shop for communities, and so we can help with any variety of materials, whether it's scrap metal, aluminum cans, glass, paper, electronics, propane tanks. We do a little of everything, and that's part of the reason why we have a fair amount of expertise in recycling markets and are glad to talk with you about that today because we're really working in all of these areas on a daily basis. And then the second key aspect of our programming is education and technical assistance. We have regular meetings for solid waste operators and other community members to learn about recycling markets and best practices. We offer facility tours to go to other communities' recycling programs and see how they're operating. We also have an annual conference each year. And then we provide quite a bit of hands-on technical assistance. Bonnie and Heather from our Member Services Department really work on a regular basis with solid waste operators in particular to answer a variety of questions that come up about how to improve your recycling programs. And then we also have some school recycling programs to help educate the next generation about recycling and waste reduction. And now I'll turn it over to Bonnie.
Thank you, Reagan. Now let's look at the foundational principles of recycling. It's important to understand why we recycle and why we want valuable material to be coming out of the waste stream. The Northeast has the highest cost for disposing solid waste or trash at an average of $85 a ton. Other parts of the country are half of that or less. We will only get it. This is only going to get more expensive as landfill and incineration because the ash from incineration does have to be landfilled. As we see less landfill space in the Northeast, making recycling more attractive over time. Conserving natural resources. We've heard this a lot. Waste diversion saves energy and natural resources. And again, as I said earlier, it saves valuable landfill capacity. This is one of Reagan's favorite examples of the importance of recycling. Recycling aluminum cans saves more than 90% of the energy needed to create new aluminum cans. Cheaper to recycle than extract more from the ground. And nearly 75% of all aluminum is produced is still in use today. Really comes down to the money. There are 3 primary types of recycling programs in New Hampshire. Source separated recycling, and this is where residents come in to the transfer stations and they separate the material right there. These source separated is very dependent on residents to do the work on the end, and then the staff at the recycling program to process that material that is separated by commodity. Dual stream recycling. This is bringing containers in one roll-off or one piece of equipment to a facility, containers being plastics, aluminum cans, steel cans, and then the second part of the dual stream is fibers, cardboard, paper, magazines, newspaper, brought into facilities like Keene, New Hampshire, where it is separated. You can see here there's a sorting line where staff separate that material that is coming in, and then it is marketed out on the other side. Single stream recycling. This is where the containers and the fibers are all mixed together, either curbside or brought to a transfer station. There's a higher cost because you have to unscramble that egg on the other end at municipal or at materials recycling facilities. And you can see here where it's a combination of staff, real people touching this material, and equipment moving this material from one place to the other to get it separated. The single stream recycling, you will see as we talk further, the single stream recycling costs have been going down considerably due to the value of that material once it is separated and marketed on the other end. Let's talk about getting those recyclables to market. Recycling a material is a commodity, and recycling only works when the material from your recycling bin is turned into something new. We have to get it from point A to point B. How do we decide how to market material and to which vendor or which company that will make it into a product? We need a reputable vendor with environmentally sound practices. Pricing. We need to get quotes and really encourage the best price for that material that has been carefully separated and it meets specifications. Service, making sure that that vendor is going to be there to pick up that material and take it to the location where it'll be made into another product. Transportation, this is part of a struggling and challenging industry right now to get material, again, from point A to point B, as far as pricing and availability of trucks to get it there. We often work at NRRA directly with a mill, or we work with a broker who works with a mill. Recycling equipment, it takes essential equipment, balers, loaders. Here you see a forklift to take that material that is brought in either in a source separated situation or a dual stream or a single stream situation. You need the right equipment to make it work. Municipalities want to densify material to get the most weight on the truck if they're doing a source separated program, and they're going to need those up-to-date balers, that good equipment to make that happen. Typically, baled material, which you can see here at the top, which is compacted, has a far greater value than loose materials that need to be processed and baled when it gets to its market. Transportation. You've all heard in the news lately that there are a lot of export containers sitting in the bays and just waiting to be unloaded. Well, this is affecting recycling as well. Most material we move is by truck, and throughout New Hampshire, Vermont, and Mass. We used to export through NRRA, and we may do that again in the future. There is becoming less and less exported material. We are handling it more domestically. Again, shortage of trucks, shortage of drivers is complicating logistics, and communities are looking at different ways of shipping material to market, sometimes using their own trucks to get it there. Did you know solid waste operators, those people who are on the front lines every day at recycling facilities, need to have a full day of basic training class and pass a written exam to obtain the DES certification, the Department of Environmental Services certification, and they need to have continuing education credits. Transfer stations are often one of the few departments generating revenue, and particularly now, if you've been paying attention to the market values, you can see that's the case. All said, we cannot appreciate them enough for all they do.
So now that we've covered some of the sort of introductory information about recycling and how communities in New Hampshire are managing their recycling programs, let's talk about recycling markets. And as Bonnie mentioned before, recyclables, they're commodities, and recycling markets change regularly like the stock market. And so we'll talk a bit about some changes that have happened in recent years that have had big impacts on recycling markets, and then bring up to today and what we're seeing with recycling markets today. And we'll even do a little prediction for the future, but we'll see how that goes. So back in late 2017, there was a big impact on recycling markets when there was an announcement that China was going to pass a policy called China's National Sword. And this was a ban that was effective January of 2018. And it banned the importation into China of all plastics, all unsorted mixed paper. And again, mixed paper is when you've got your newspaper and your magazines and your junk mail and all those things sort of mixed together. And it also banned textiles, clothing, fabric. Also some glass and metals. And then interestingly, just as recently as this year, that ban was expanded to essentially include all waste products, including cardboard, that were not allowed to be taken into the country. And so when this ban was announced in late 2017, it had a really dramatic impact on the value of recyclables worldwide, because at that time, China was one of the world's largest purchasers of recyclable material. And of course, as we know, when demand drops but supply continues to stay steady, the price of something drops. And so we saw a really significant impact on recycling markets. And that's probably something you've heard about in the news. You might have heard that recycling is dead, recycling's over, because there were some problems that were impacting communities at that time. But why did China implement this ban? I think it's helpful to understand the context. And that is because at the time, China was receiving largely material from single stream recycling programs. And as Bonnie mentioned, we can see in single stream recycling programs that there tends to be a higher rate of contamination, materials in there that we don't want to see, like crushed glass making it into a paper bale or something like that, or plastic making it into a cardboard load. And China didn't have the systems in place to really handle the trash that was coming in with their recycling. And it led to some pretty severe environmental problems in the country because of that lack of infrastructure. And so really it was a lot of factors, but sort of the public relations aspect of plastic dumping that you might have heard about, that was one of the leading things that led China to implement this ban. And so to understand the impact of China's National Sword and then more recent changes in recycling markets, it's helpful to understand the average composition of a residential recycling stream. So this pie chart gives us a snapshot for a single stream system where a community puts all of their recyclables together in one bin. And this is what would come out of a typical materials recovery facility based on a survey that was done by the Northeast Recycling Council in 2019. And what they show is that when you're looking at what's coming out of one of these sorting facilities, over half of the material by weight is fibers. So cardboard, mixed paper, other types of papers. I would say commonly that number is closer to 60%, if not higher than 60%. You see that glass, which is very heavy, was about 15% of what was coming out of these facilities. And then this number, residue, the gray one, at almost 14%, residue coming out of one of these facilities is talking about the trash or the things that they can't recycle. So these are the materials that we really wish weren't in our recycling streams, but they're still making it into these facilities, and then they have to pay for this trash or non-recyclable material to be thrown away. And then by weight, the smallest amount of items you're going to see in your typical recycling program are plastic, because it's very lightweight, even if there's a lot of it. And then metal, like aluminum cans. So the key takeaway that I'd like you to get from this chart is that over half of the weight from a residential recycling program, whether it's single stream, whether it's source separated, whether it's dual stream, it's going to be typically from fibers, cardboard, and various papers. And so what we're going to do is talk about each of these different material types individually, and then look at current pricing for them relative to one another. Starting with fibers, this was the single biggest impact we saw from China's national sort policy, was that there was this dramatic impact on the value worldwide of mixed paper and cardboard. And that's because, as you can see, before China's national sort policy, China purchased over half of the world's scrap paper, which is a pretty staggering amount. Interestingly, China was not a major end market for US recycled paper. But Chinese mills were still a really important end market for mixed paper especially. And even today, we find that of the material that is being exported out of the United States, most commonly we're seeing mixed paper is an item that is more often exported than used domestically. Now, the silver lining of this precipitous drop that we saw worldwide in the value of cardboard and mixed paper is that we ended up having more domestic investment in paper mills in the United States because there was an opportunity there to build capacity to take up some of this excess material. And so the Northeast Recycling Council has a series of great reports where they track capacity for fibers throughout North America, primarily the United States, some in Canada and some in Mexico. And based on their most recent report from earlier this year, they have tracked 30 new or existing mills that are increasing their capacity to use recycled fibers as a feedstock. So some of these are brand new mills that are being built. Most of them are either existing mills that are either switching from using virgin material to using more recycled content, or it might be closed mills that are being reopened now. And the capacity at these mills, they're mostly producing cardboard boxes and also what's called linerboard. I mean, both of these are for, creating new cardboard boxes. And they're primarily going to use cardboard as their feedstock. But about half or so of these mills, they also plan to use some amount of mixed paper as a feedstock. And at this point, about half of these 30 projects have been completed. It's not certain that all the remaining mills will be built or the expansions will happen, but this is just a really good sign that domestically we are increasing our capacity to recycle our own cardboard and mixed paper and not have to rely on overseas markets as heavily. So this is good news that came out of China's national sort. So let's talk about what happened during COVID, because for quite a while, all we would talk about is China's national sword. But now COVID, the pandemic has come along and it really has had a noticeable impact on recycling markets. So overall, one of the really important impacts that's happened that we see in New Hampshire and elsewhere is that communities are seeing a pretty significant increase in the amount of recycling and trash that is coming to their transfer stations. And when you think about it, this makes sense. At the very beginning of the pandemic, in the spring of 2020, we saw businesses shut down, schools shut down, and everyone was at home. And so the material that we would normally be generating in businesses or schools was shifted to the home. And so what we saw is that it was not unusual for our local communities to report maybe a 30% increase in the amount of trash and recycling and construction and demolition debris coming their way. A lot of folks, as you know, once they were home, they started cleaning out their garages. They started working on home projects. And so that generates a lot of material. And so what we're going to do is talk a bit about the initial impacts from the pandemic. And now, since we've been in it for a while, we're going to talk about current pricing. And then, as I mentioned, we'll also give a little bit of our crystal ball prediction. Looking at initial impacts, as I mentioned, fibers are really important because they're such a large component of the recycling stream. So what we saw at the very beginning of the impact was a very noticeable jump in the value of fibers, cardboard and mixed paper. Both in April and May of 2020, we really saw those that pricing go up. And then it dropped in June. And so the reason is because when businesses shut down, businesses have traditionally been a very good, steady supply of cardboard, in particular, clean cardboard that mills are very happy to have. And so when those businesses shut down and suddenly this supply was gone, companies that acquire this material to make into new packaging, they had to raise their prices so that they could get enough material, because our domestic mills really have remained open throughout the pandemic, pretty much business as usual, while of course, taking on additional protective measures. And with everyone at home, there was an even increased demand for online ordering, having Amazon boxes shipped to your house. And so mills really needed this material in order to make those boxes, to make tissues, to make paper towels, all those things that were in high demand, especially right in the beginning of the pandemic. So residential recycling became really important in those early days. And we actually saw a video from the Environmental Protection Agency urging Americans to recycle their material because it was really necessary at that time. But then in June of 2020, we sort of saw things even out of it. Anyone who had been sitting on some excess material who sold it in April and May, that got our mills back to what they needed. Now, earlier in the pandemic, in terms of plastics, we saw the value of plastics largely down, especially for those #1 PET soda bottles, like you see for your water bottles or your clear soda bottles. And part of the reason why we saw pricing down for those was because in the early days of the pandemic, people weren't spending as much money. And so the apparel and carpet manufacturing industries weren't doing as much business. And those are a major end market for recycled water bottles, #1 PET water bottles. Now, plastic always generates lots of questions. And so in order for us to have a bit more of, to understand a more nuanced market impact on the different types of plastics, we're going to cover a bit of basic information about plastics next before we kind of get back into market impacts on plastics. So to start with, we have a lot of different plastics out there. So there's sort of 7 different types of plastics that we commonly think about with recycling. And they all have those numbers on them. And here's what those numbers mean. And the main ones that we're going to see in residential recycling programs are #1 PET. That's those clear water bottles or soda bottles. We have #2 HDP natural. And that is like your translucent milk jug, an uncolored milk jug. And then we've got #2 HDPE colored. And that's commonly, you might see that as your brightly colored laundry detergent bottle. And then number 3, PVC, we're typically not seeing that in residential recycling programs, but that would be plastic tubing. Number 4, LDPE, that's like your plastic grocery bags. And so while those can be returned to retailers, you're typically not able to recycle those at your local transfer station. Number 5, polypropylene. This is often used for yogurt containers. It's a lighter weight plastic that's quite sturdy for yogurt containers. And then number 6, polystyrene, what we would call styrofoam. Again, you're not going to find outlets for recycling that typically at your local transfer station. And then number 7 is just a mix. It's just a mix of other multiple plastics. So we don't know what's in number 7. So you typically cannot send those in your local recycling program. Now, as I mentioned, we get a lot of questions about plastics. There's a lot of confusion about plastics. And that's in part because of this, what we call the chasing arrows sign. There's some official name for it, but I call it the chasing arrow sign because I think people typically know what that means. And this is, it doesn't mean a lot. It's a voluntary system that has basically no regulation. And it only tells you what is the predominant type of resin in the plastic. So is it a number 1? Is it a number 2? Is it a mystery number 7? And that's all. It by no means tells you if something is recyclable or not. And unfortunately, it really does cause a lot of confusion for people. So just understand that this is not proof that something is recyclable. It's just a clue as to what type of plastic you're talking about. Then when we look at how communities recycle their plastic, in New Hampshire, we're typically seeing communities recycling their plastic in a few different ways. Now, certainly if you are in a community that has single or dual stream recycling, you might find that you have what's essentially a 1 through 7 mixed plastic. And some source separated communities also will allow their residents to put sort of all of their plastics together. Now, it is important to look at exactly what your community says is allowed. Just because it's what's called sort of a 1 through 7 mixed plastic, they don't really want things like that PVC pipe tubing or those sort of mystery number 7s typically. We're usually looking at containers and tubs with lids. So the benefit of sort of having a mixed recycling program for plastic is that it's just easier for residents. You can put more stuff together. You don't have to be quite as particular about separating things out. It's easier for transfer station staff. And about a quarter of all the plastics that we recycle through NRRA are 1 through 7 mixed plastics. Now, the next option that you'll commonly see in source separated communities is communities who will recycle number 1s and number 2s, and then they'll probably be landfilling the rest. So the 3 through 7s. So all of these individual items here, number 1 peat, number 1 HDP natural, and number HDP colored. Remember, that's sort of your water bottles, your milk jugs, and your laundry detergent bottles. All of those have stable markets for recycling. And so you're going to need to have separate areas, 3 separate areas for storing these 3 different plastics. And I'll point out that number 5 plastics, which you commonly see for yogurt containers, those have a steady market for recycling them. But typically our communities that source separate in New Hampshire, they tend to not have enough volume to be able to justify sorting that material and baling it and sending it to market. We have some exceptions, but it's just not very common. And then lastly, we have communities with what are called Z bales, where they bale all of their number 2 plastics together. And so actually in this picture, you can see we've got number 1 plastic baled on the left, and then we've got some Z bales on the right. And one thing that you'll find is that you have a lower value for a Z bale than if you separated out those 2 different plastics. But again, it's easier for residents. It saves space. So this is sort of a fun question, which is just want to have everyone take a moment to guess, what is the most valuable recyclable by weight? of all the items in your recycling bin? And the answer often surprises people. And so this is sort of a fun party trick. And keep in mind that this will change over time, but right now, the answer for quite some time has been that number 2 HDPE natural, so your translucent milk jug. Or, this time of year, it could be your apple cider jug. Just keep in mind, it takes a lot of plastic to get a ton of material. But the reason why this type of plastic is the most valuable by far of everything in your recycling bin by weight is because it's a versatile plastic. It can be made into any color. It can be turned into a variety of different things. You might see it turned into plastic furniture. So there's just a lot of uses for this particular material. And then, let's move on and talk about aluminum cans. One of the things we saw that was interesting earlier in the pandemic was there was actually a shortage of aluminum cans. And I would have loved to think that that was going to increase the value of aluminum cans, but it didn't. And that's because this shortage was not from a lack of supply of aluminum cans to recycle. The shortage was actually from everyone being at home, and suddenly bars and restaurants were not serving, alcohol out of kegs, and people were drinking more at home, more of everything at home. And so there was just this huge surge in demand for more canned beverages, and manufacturers just couldn't keep up. I think that has sorted out better now, but that was something that we saw earlier in the pandemic that was kind of interesting. And lastly, glass. I have to say, glass is a tricky one because before China's national sword, after China's national sword, during the pandemic, glass has really kind of stayed steady. In terms of actually, you typically have to pay to recycle glass. And that's because we have some challenges with glass recycling in the Northeast. Glass is heavy, it's expensive to transport. There was a major bottling plant in Massachusetts that closed very abruptly in 2018, and that was an outlet for a lot of glass that was recycled in New England. And we increasingly see over time things like Pyrex and ceramics, candle containers, things that look like glass and people think they're glass. But if you get it into your glass, it's actually very problematic for the process of creating new glass bottles and jars or creating fiberglass insulation. It damages equipment, it creates imperfections in new bottles. And so it's just, we've had a challenging time in some ways in New England and New Hampshire in particular with finding good outlets for glass. Now, for single and dual stream communities, you might find that there are financial benefits of removing glass from your recycling stream. It depends on the company you work with, but there are companies out there who will provide maybe a $5 per ton reduction in cost if a community keeps their glass out of that stream. And so then, of course, the question becomes, what do you do with your glass if you're not going to include it in your single and dual stream recycling? So at the Northeast Resource Recovery Association, we have 2 different programs that are available for communities to recycle their glass. Overall, we have about 100 communities in New Hampshire, Vermont, and Massachusetts that participate in this program to recycle their glass. And so the first program is for glass bottles and jars only, food grade. And this material is sent to our vendor in Canada, who cleans it, crushes it, processes it, and then sends it back into the United States to companies that are making it into new bottles or into fiberglass insulation. And we have about 40 communities that participate in that program. We have Keene and Lebanon are host sites where communities can bring their glass to consolidate enough glass before we can send it to our vendor in Canada. And the communities can save quite a bit of money by, as I said, pulling glass out of their stream. So, for example, at one time, Stratford, Vermont was paying $121 a ton for their dual stream recycling. And by removing their glass and sending it to our host site in Lebanon, they were able to pay only $40 a ton to recycle that glass. So it can really be a beneficial consideration for communities. The program we offer to communities for glass is our processed glass aggregate program. And this is a program where, again, you can include glass bottles and jars, but you can also include things like Pyrex, ceramics, window glass, things that we would not be able to send to be made into fiberglass or new glass bottles and jars. And so again, we have host sites where communities can take their material. In New Hampshire, we have New London, Littleton, and the waste management turnkey facility in Rochester. And once we get enough glass aggregated at those locations, we work with a vendor to bring in a glass crushing unit. And then the material can be used as a sub base for various infrastructure projects. So communities will use it under parking lots or under sidewalks or under the foundation of a building. It can be used in place of gravel and sand. And we have about 60 communities that are participating in this program. So now that we've talked about these individual commodities and we've talked about sort of what we've seen with pricing for those earlier in the pandemic, now we're going to take a look at what I think is sort of the most exciting slide, if you will. We try not to get a ton of numbers at you, but this one slide is really worth it because I think it's very enlightening for people. So Bonnie's going to walk us through a snapshot of our current pricing.
Happy to do that, especially right now in the markets that we're looking at. Just before we move on from glass, I just wanted to let everyone know that our glass crusher is down at our Cape Cod site in Dennis, Mass, just as an aside, and they are crushing over 1,600 tons down there to be made into an aggregate for use on the Cape. So that's very exciting. We're looking at pricing from comparative from November 2020 to November 2021. And we'll look at all of those commodities that Reagan mentioned. If we start with those high valued milk jugs or HDPE natural, we'll see that in 1 year's time, the value of that went up 60%. Now, to put it in some perspective, typically aluminum cans are worth maybe 50 cents a pound. HDPE natural went up well over $1 a pound for that material. Again, another perspective would be one bale of HDPE natural would be worth between $1,000 and $1,200 on the market as it stood pretty much into the end of October and into November. So very exciting times for material that we've been moving all along, but it's finally taken on some incredible value. Aluminum cans has just started to make an increase in the last few months, which is very exciting because it was sort of stagnant for quite a while. So we're seeing that is a shining light in the markets as they stand right now. Colored, you can see HDPE colored, you can see it was up 26% all the way down to cardboard, which was on a good spin anyway as far as pricing. So it doesn't look like it went up that much, but it is still in the high 180 a ton. And we're talking about between $3,000 and $4,000 for a tractor trailer load of cardboard shipped to market. So all of these different things coming out, we have to think about if we're potentially getting a high of $2,000 a ton for milk jugs, and we're keeping it out of the waste stream, that's putting a real high value on these materials that are not being thrown away at $70 to $120 a ton to pay to throw it away. So all of these programs that we have in place right now are really kind of rethinking what they're doing, maybe separating out more material. How can they be more creative in getting it to market? So it's this last year has prompted a lot of interesting discussions on how we can do it better, how we can capture more material and get it to market. Looking ahead, we have been talking to some of our vendors, and we have been in the high on most materials as far as their value at the market, but our vendors are telling us that there has been so much response that a lot of the domestic mills are full. There's little to no exporting of these recyclable materials, particularly the fibers. That, as Reagan said, is a big portion of our recycling stream. So we're expecting a drop in value over the next few months, starting today with the index, a fiber index that we look forward to seeing every month to show us what is cardboard going to go for at the market, what is mixed paper going to go for at the market, is office paper going to go up or down. Again, little to no exporting of these materials, and the domestic mills are getting a little bit full. So that's going to change the market pricing. There will always be, I guess, that my comment that I make in any opportunity to speak is that good quality, dry, stored under cover material is going to find a market. So that's where we're looking ahead. It's not as encouraging as the last year as far as pricing, but still high value material. Budget impacts. This is the time of year when NRRA gets the questions of what's going to go up, what's going to go down as far as pricing. Is glass pricing going to go up? Is the cost to get rid of my tires going to change? And this is where this is the time of the year that we talk to as many vendors as possible to make sure that their pricing, if it's going to change, we're going to give our members, a heads up as to whether that's going to happen. So this is a pretty important time, October and November, so that we can make sure that municipalities can plan ahead. We don't like surprises anymore than municipalities do. So recent market impacts, sometimes even getting some revenue now for single and dual stream recycling. The increase in the revenue from the source separated materials is actually partnered with a decrease in the cost for single and dual stream recycling. So if it's separated, it's baled, it's marketed in tractor trailer loads, and the markets are high, you're going to start to see those single stream costs come down. And that's been very encouraging for some of our big single stream recycling communities who are now in a situation where they may not even be paying per ton, then they may be getting a little bit of revenue back. Direct relationship between markets up, single stream recycling and dual stream recycling costs down. A comparative revenue example, for a community, we looked at a community that recycles cardboard, mixed paper, plastics, aluminum, and steel cans, and we looked at 1 year compared to the next. The revenue that they received for their separated material was doubled in July 20 to June 21 from the year prior. So that's, putting that revenue back into the general fund or back into a special revenue fund for the town. That's huge. A recent plastics example, we've talked a lot about HDP natural, which you can see here in a bale. And again, translucent milk and water jugs. One resident actually sent a combined load, and we're talking a tractor trailer load of plastics. So they had some of the number 2 HDP natural on board, some of the HDPE mixed colored, and some of the number 1 PET water and soda bottles, and all put on one load, all shipped from New Hampshire out to Michigan to our vendor. And their revenue, the money that went back to this facility, was almost $25,000 for that one tractor trailer load. 73 cents a pound was the average of that material. And those are typical over the years aluminum can prices, not plastics pricing. So they hit the high, they did very well, and they had the clean commodity. Just as an aside, when we market materials, we need to send pictures of that material, every load, to our vendor to make sure that they are exactly what they're paying these prices for. So I had the opportunity to tell that community that check was coming, and they were very excited. And as we talked about, as recyclable value goes up, single stream pricing goes down, and this has been the best example over the past year of that actually happening. Again, we're looking at numbers, but we're seeing in the beginning in November of 2020, there was a cost of single stream was around $120, $125 a ton to get rid of. And when we look at November 2021, we're more in that $20, $22 a ton pricing. Now, some single stream communities may have a contract which doesn't reflect the market changes, and we certainly would recommend that. But it is very stark how this is the markets and the good markets affect single stream pricing. Key marketing factors. Whether you have source separated or dual stream or single stream recycling, the quality of the material is huge. It's going to affect the pricing on the other end. And we want to encourage all facilities, no matter how they're processing their recycling, to keep that material dry. So storage is very important. So when it goes to market, you've got a quality material going to market to get the best market value for that material. So storage, staff and storage is one of the two things that we hear from our solid waste operators the most. I don't have enough staff to move all of the material, and we need more storage to store the material before it goes to market to keep it dry, particularly in New England, particularly in the rain that we've been having and the snow that we will be getting eventually. So key marketing factors. Speaking of storage, again, this is not the best example, but we decided to use it anyway. We don't want to see material stored outside. Oftentimes, if we move a material that has rain or in it, it's going to take a hit. They're not going to get paid for that full amount. It's going to be deducted on that total weight. But we did have one community in the northern part of the state that did have enough storage. And they started asking me, I'd like to move a load of aluminum cans back in September of 2020. The pricing back then was 58 cents a pound. And they said, no, we're going to hold. We're hearing that the pricing is going to go up. So they had the opportunity and the storage to wait. So every month, we'd go back to our vendor and we'd say, what's the pricing for this commodity in this location, this weight? And finally, in October of 2021, they said sell. So they gambled and they won. So instead of 58 cents a pound, it was 73 cents a pound. And they ended up making over $16,000 for that load. So their gamble paid off, and they had the opportunity to do so. We don't see that very often, but it was kind of fun. Staffing challenges, as I alluded to before. I have one community that called me the other day saying we're down to 2 people. Now, 2 people on a busy Saturday when there are 400 to 500 cars going through, that's a lot to keep up with. A concern is that we're starting to see some staffing burnout. We're starting, what do you do if one of those staff members calls in sick that day? So towns have really started to think about how can we do this different. Hiring is difficult for sure. We see a lot of highway department staff come in on the weekends to help cover staffing. So yeah, staffing challenges, as in any part of the world right now is really hitting our recycling industry. Solid waste budget tools. Most of these are familiar to you, but we really are going to be talking more about these in the next year or so, encouraging people to look into different ways of saving money, putting their money into different funds. So one of them is pay as you throw, which is a user fee system that when residents come into the facility with their MSW, their waste, they would pay per bag. And it basically encourages people to keep the recyclables out so they don't have to pay for them. And it charges those people who choose not to recycle, they have to pay for all of that material. So it's really, do I want that dollar coming out of my pocket to pay for my waste if I can save it by recycling? That's a powerful tool. A couple of the northern country towns are in the 60% recycling rate because of pay as you throw. A special revenue fund. What happens to that $24,000 that came in for the plastics load that went out of our southern New Hampshire town? If it went into a special revenue fund, then that was earmarked, that money, for the transfer station. It's not, it has to be approved at town meeting, so it's not going to go away. It's just going to take that revenue out of the general fund. And what I like about a special revenue fund is it really shows the residents the potential of the work, well, the revenue that as a result of the work they have done to recycle. Let's put it that way. Motor vehicle registration fees, we all pay every time we register our car. There was a motor vehicle registration fee that covers the cost of disposal of tires, batteries, waste oil. And some communities, it's just part of the general budget. But one of our northern New Hampshire towns actually has that money go back into the transfer station budget because that's where those materials are handled. And I like that idea a lot. Looking at disposal fees that are charged at your recycling facilities. Are you getting for each tire what it cost you to get rid of that tire? Reviewing those disposal fees to make sure that you are covering your costs, particularly in construction debris right now, which is getting more expensive to deal with. Full cost accounting. NRRA just had a full cost accounting class where we had a number of communities come with stacks of paper and looked at the transfer station budget, looked at revenue coming in, and was able to come up with some really interesting figures, which Reagan will be talking about in a little bit. So what tools can you use to make this better?
And so we're going to talk a little bit more about the bottom two, starting with full cost accounting. So as Bonnie mentioned, full cost accounting, it's the system for understanding your solid waste program costs and revenues. And this is a system that was actually developed by the US Environmental Protection Agency years ago. And it's this very systematic approach for identifying and characterizing all of the costs of providing solid waste services. And this is a valuable tool for community because unlike your budget, which is only going to show you certain items, full cost accounting takes into account your direct costs and your indirect costs, your prior capital expenditures, future capital purchases that you're expecting. It really gives you a much more realistic look at what it takes to manage your solid waste program. And so as Bonnie mentioned, we recently had a workshop at the New Hampshire Department of Environmental Services for facility managers, where we went into depth about full cost accounting. And after doing an introduction with more information about what this system involves, we worked one-on-one with the participants in that workshop to help them actually determine their cost per resident, their cost per ton of material that they manage in their communities. And there was quite a bit of homework involved in advance, as you might imagine. To really dig into these numbers, you have to have a lot of information at the ready. But essentially, what we did is we grouped expenses into 4 different categories, 4 different paths. one for recycling, one for waste to energy for communities that do use waste to energy, one for composting for communities that compost, and then last for landfill. For many communities, you just might have recycling and landfill, or recycling and waste to energy, or some combination of these. But by breaking down your solid waste costs in this way, it really can give you a holistic view of your solid waste program. So as an example, Brian Patno from Lancaster was one of the presenters of this workshop, and he prepared a pretty recent look at solid waste costs for his community. And what you can see is that their total annual cost per person for managing all their solid waste programs was almost $64 a person. And you can see that the bulk of that cost was under landfilling at about $56 a person. And then recycling actually ends up costing quite a lot less, and composting, only a few cents. And what's interesting is that I think some people, they look at some of the examples that Bonnie shared of the value you can get from recyclables, but they rightly point out that it tends to take more staff time to manage a recycling program. It is a little more streamlined if you have residents come in and throw away their trash, and maybe they're not recycling at all, or maybe you have a single stream recycling program. If you do fully source separated recycling, it does take more staff time to manage those different materials. However, a really important piece that I think often goes unappreciated is the avoided cost that's associated with recycling. So when you recycle an item, you're either making revenue off of it, or maybe you're paying a little bit to recycle it, but it's almost always going to save you a greater amount of money than you would have had to pay if you had to throw that item away. And we call that cost avoidance. So for example, in the example I gave earlier of the community in Stratford, Vermont, that was previously paying $121 a ton for their dual stream recycling, well, they started paying $40 a ton for their glass. And even though they're paying to recycle that glass, it still has a large cost avoidance for them. It saves them quite a bit of money they were otherwise going to have to spend to recycle that material. Or, in New Hampshire, communities can throw away certain items, but you're usually still going to actually save money by recycling those items. And that's one of the benefits of doing a full cost accounting model, is that you can truly get a real understanding of what your different programs are costing you and what it really takes to manage your solid waste program. And so to give you a specific example, as Bonnie mentioned, there's benefits in taking an annual look at the fees that you're charging for different items at your recycling center. And so there's a great example from Guilford, New Hampshire. They looked and determined that the fees that they were taking in to cover their costs of construction and demolition debris disposal, the fees they accepted only covered about 55% of their costs. And construction and demolition debris is an expensive item to throw away. And so it was costing the town nearly $40,000 above and beyond the fees that they were charging residents or local contractors in order to dispose of that material. And so by having detailed records and looking carefully at their fees, Guilford was able to use this information to make the case to purchase a truck scale for their community so that they can accurately weigh the amount of material coming in, because what they found is it was very difficult for the transfer station staff to, accurately estimate by sight how much material someone was bringing in, and therefore it was difficult to charge them appropriately for the amount of material they were bringing in as construction and demolition debris. So this is just one great example of how a community can do a deeper dive into their finances and the cost of their solid waste program, and then make informed decisions for them to identify opportunities and solutions to challenges that they're facing. And because we believe so strongly in the value of full cost accounting, we were glad to participate in that DES workshop recently. And then also NRRA was fortunate to receive a grant from the United States Department of Agriculture, our Recycling with Results grant, And as part of that, we are going to be helping over the next year communities develop full cost accounting models for their solid waste programs here in New Hampshire. And so there are certain eligibility requirements. We're going to be focusing on the smallest communities, those with a population of under 5,500 people, and also working with communities whose household income is below the state median for average household income. So there are some criteria for that, and we do have more information on our website if anyone is interested in possibly working with us under this grant. So our website is NRRArecycles.org. And I have a link to the full cost accounting workshop that was taught with the Department of Environmental Services. All the materials, including the presentation, the very complicated Excel documents. You're welcome to look at them, but it is useful to have someone walk you through them. And so if you'd like to learn more, you can join our free email newsletter that we send out every other week that has recycling market information and also information about services like those we'll provide under this Recycling with Results grant. We also have an extensive resource library on our website that has prior recorded webinars, articles, all free information that's available for communities. And lastly, I did want to let folks know that we are holding our annual conference in the middle of May of next year. And it is our hope to have a hybrid conference, not unlike how the Municipal Association is doing their conference. So we hope to be in person, but also provide an option for people to join us remotely. So please do save the date on that. And as I mentioned, since we are working with the USDA on a grant, they think it's very important that I let you know that everything we said today does not represent their views. And with that, we're at the end of our presentation, and we would be very happy to answer any questions that people have in the chat. And thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you.